Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Andrew Lawson and Dr. Katy Shaw. Andrew is Reader in American Literature at Leeds Beckett University. He leads the Centre's research strand on cultures of class and social inequality. Andrew's research interests are in the interdisciplinary study of American literature and history, with a particular focus on the history of capitalism in the United States and the formation of the middle class. His first book was Walt Whitman and the Class Struggle. He's also published Downwardly Mobile, The Changing Fortunes of American Literature, and edited a collection of essays, Class and the Making of American Literature, Created Unequal. Katy is Principal Lecturer in English Literature and Associate Director of the Centre for Culture and the Arts. Her research interests include contemporary literature, especially working class literature, cultural representations of post-industrial regeneration, and the languages of comedy. Her books include David Peace, Texts and Contexts, and Mining the Meaning, Cultural Representations of the 1984-5 UK miners' strike. Her most recently published book, Crunch Lit, concerns recession writings, literature that responds to the financial crisis of 2008. Today, Andrew and Katy will be talking to us on the subject of retaking the commons, culture, politics, and the public realm. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Susan. Hello, everybody. Katy and I are going to be talking about culture and economics and two different ways of understanding and ordering the economy, capitalism and the commons. I'll start by describing how capitalism works and why it fails to deliver on its promises. Katy will pick up on the theme of capitalism and suggest how we can rethink the economy in fairer and more inclusive ways. I want to start, with the economic transformation of the 1980s. Up until the 1980s, a lot of what we had was held in common. The roads, the electricity grid, the railways, the water and sewage system, the universal postage system, the telecoms network, public housing, schools, and healthcare were largely created, owned, and administered by the state. It's hard to believe now, but before 1979, the British state actually built whole towns, new towns. And I know this because I was born and grew up in one of them. But then, this happened. The government of the day, led by Margaret Thatcher, turned state-owned industries and assets into private companies, answerable not to the public, but to their shareholders. Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in America were guided by what James Meek calls, in his recent book, Private Island, the market belief system, also known as neoliberalism. Britain was converted from a mixed economy of state-owned and private sector businesses to an economy where almost everything became private. The public realm and the common good became the terrain of markets capitalism. So what do I mean by capitalism? Capitalism is basically private enterprise, a system of private wealth accumulation. It involves individuals making profits for themselves by getting other people to work for them and then competing with other capitalist individuals to sell some kind of product or service in the marketplace. Capitalism has a vague notion of the common good because in theory the net result of all these individual efforts to accumulate wealth results in higher living standards for everyone and economic growth. There are winners and losers, but it's also generally accepted and hoped for that there will be improved living standards for everyone. Economic growth is a rising tide that lifts all the boats. But here's the problem. In the most developed countries of the world, economic growth since the 1970s has been falling. This chart smooths out short-term changes or fluctuations to show the long-term trend of economic growth. It shows that growth since the 1970s has been very bumpy, struggling to hold on to a decent average of around 3 or 4% per year, falling steeply in the mid-2000s, stabilizing briefly, and then falling towards zero at the time of the global credit crunch and the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So how do we explain the apparent failure of capitalism to deliver on its basic promise of economic growth for everyone forever? The answer, I think, is under-consumption. Underconsumption is an idea based on Marx's theory of surplus value, although Marx didn't develop the theory himself. The starting point of Marx's theory is that workers have to sell to a capitalist their labour power, meaning their ability to work for a given quantity of time. In return, workers receive a wage, which is the price the capitalist puts on the things workers need to keep showing up at work, predominantly food, clothing, and housing. Workers do two different things for the capitalist. First, they transfer into the finished products or service the value of the raw materials, energy, and technology used to produce them. But more importantly, labour power creates a new value over and above the price the capitalist has put on it in the workers' wages. It is this surplus value derived from living labour that's the source of the profit the capitalist makes by selling the product or service in the marketplace. Capitalists accumulate profits by exploiting the difference between what workers produce and what they receive for their upkeep. When it comes to hiring labour, capitalists hold all the cards. But in order to keep on making profits, they have to sell their products and services back to their workforce. It's only when they achieve sales that capitalists realise their profits. Marx calls this capital's salta mortale, its fatal leap. If labour in its totality cannot afford to buy back the products offered to it by capital, then industrial capitalism has a major problem. And underconsumption theory says that it does in fact have this problem. Because workers can never receive wages that reflect the full value of their labour, they can never afford to buy enough goods and services to keep the whole system of accumulation going. To see this, we need to look at the basic structure of a capitalist firm or enterprise. Some part of the firm's income must always go to what Marx called the means of production, but plant and equipment, as I've got it there. Capital goods, raw materials, energy. The rest is spent on wages to workers or taken in profits by the firm's owners. The key point is that spending on the means of production is always subordinate to spending accounted for by wages and profits. Capitalists can only invest new money in production if A, workers are buying goods and services, and B, therefore, capitalists are making profits. Now imagine that the whole of a nation's economy is one giant firm with one product. The sum total of all assets, goods and services that can be owned or exchanged. Economists call this net national income, but I prefer to think of it as the social product. It's what we as society produce together. The social product is divided into labour's share, paid in wages, salaries and bonuses, and the share of income going to capital, paid in industrial profits, but also in land rents, building rents, dividends, interest, capital gains, and intellectual property. Since the 18th century, about 1/3 of national income has gone to capital and 2/3 to labour. Wages spent by workers and profits spent by capital are the main source of effective demand in the economy, which means demand backed by a money payment. Workers tend to spend most, if not all, of their wages on the goods and services they help to produce. They therefore buy back a portion of the net products. But since workers can never receive the whole of net income, they can never buy back the whole of net product. Workers' consumption always leaves a demand gap. Since workers' wages are too low, they can't keep showing up in the markets to buy the goods and services offered by capitalists. Lack of effective demand means that capitalists can't realise profits. And without the rational expectation of profits, capitalists can't throw more capital into the means of production in the form of new investment spending. So capitalism is faced with the permanent possibility of underconsumption, meaning that it can't keep on expanding for very long before it hits a crisis. Capitalists temporarily solved the crisis that began in the 1970s by offshoring production to the east and creating a new workforce, a new global proletariat to produce goods and services for the world market. But this new proletariat was, of course, bought on the cheap, with low wages that made global production more efficient. The result has been a long-term decline in labour's share of national income across the world. The black line is labour share in the corporate sector, which means enterprises owned by shareholders. The red line is all the workers of the world. Corporations plus businesses without shareholders, sole proprietors, non-profit organisations, state-owned enterprises, and so on. And this includes the informal labour sector, which is especially large in China and forms most of the economy in India. Since its wages, by definition, cannot be higher than those of workers in the developed world, the new proletariat cannot fill the demand gap. In emerging economies, the labour share is down. In Turkey, down 17% since 1970, and in Saudi Arabia, down nearly 15%. In developed economies, the most dramatic fall in labour share has been in Spain, down 17%, with the US down 11%. This is the effect on household incomes in the world's leading economy, the United States, since 1995. In this period, the blue line, representing gross domestic products, rose, although not in a straight line. Household income initially rose in line with GDP growth, but started to fall and has been trending downwards in the red line pretty steadily since the year 2000. The story is actually worse than this because relative poverty has been rising in the United States. In 2011, 17% of households earned less than 50% of median household income, indicating an inability to access the goods and services that are regarded as customary or the norm. So, how do people get by when their wages aren't high enough, either to buy the things they want or to meet their basic needs? Answer, they use the plastic safety net provided by credit cards and take out home loans. Wider access to credit, though, conceals the relative impoverishment of labour until interest rates rise and credit becomes too expensive, as happened in 2007 in the United States, triggering the meltdown in the subprime mortgage market, which caused the crash. The financial crisis was a crisis of underconsumption. The human results of the relative impoverishment of labour by capital are shown in a series of photos taken by photojournalist Ryan Coombs, which I came across in the research for my journal article, Foreclosure Stories, Neoliberal Suffering in the Great Recession. Coombs's photo essay, Foreclosed, shows the interiors of two different homes, abandoned and repossessed by the banks in the period after the financial crisis. The photos show, with devastating clarity, how both the middle class and the working class are forced by low wages to rely on credits in the form of high-risk loans and subprime mortgages. So middle-class households need credits to sustain a comfortable lifestyle with flat-screen TVs and so on. And this is the middle-class home. Working-class families need credit just to put a roof over their heads. This is what the gap between labour share and the total wealth of the society looks like for those with eyes to see. So, global labour is unable to buy enough to stimulate demand. What about the capitalists themselves? Perhaps the most well-known economic fact at the moment comes out of the research into wealth and income inequality by Thomas Piketty. The top 1% in the United States currently receives about 20% of national income and owns about 40% of total wealth, the highest levels since the 1920s. So you might therefore ask, since capitalists are richer than ever, why can't they fill the demand gap with their own consumption spending? The answer is that luxury consumption by relatively few people at the very top cannot expand the economy as a whole. There are only so many mansions, yachts, and private planes that any one person can own, and their purchase does not use up enough surplus capital. Because of advances in computer and information technology, the means of production have also got cheaper and need less spending. Once the 1% have attended to their private needs and desires, there's nowhere else for their capital to go except savings. And so we have the current conjuncture. The social product takes the form of stockpiles of cash, excess savings hoarded by a small minority of capitalists, while lower and middle incomes fall and the needs of the vast majority go unmet. it looks like capitalism's latest accumulation crisis, even to the capitalists themselves. A 2013 Financial Times article quotes Gary Greenberg, head of emerging markets at Hermes Fund Managers, as saying that there has been a battle between capital and labour, and basically capital has won. But Labour's reduced spending power means that companies' top line isn't going to be growing very much. The article goes on, Richard Lewis, head of global equities at Fidelity Worldwide Investment, who has studied this trend, believes it to be structural rather than cyclical, and therefore unlikely to reverse. Mr. Lewis muses whether Marx was right all along, and that capitalism ultimately sows the seeds of its own destruction, when there is no consumer demand and it all falls over. So I think you know you're in a really serious crisis when investment analysts start going over to Marx. To conclude this part then, capitalism is always in crisis because of its basic need to extract surplus value from workers. This means that capitalism cannot give enough people the buying power needed to sustain it over time. But the fundamental problem is actually a political one. We live in a world in which capitalists are in possession of the whole social product. Capitalists own the means of production. They decide how much to pay in wages, and they take all the profits. Very little of the economy is owned in common, and there's almost no room for us as a society to decide how to distribute the social product fairly as well as efficiently. These problems have been with us for a long time. How do we solve them? Over to Katy.
No big ask then, really. So I get to do the slightly nicer job than poor Andrew of thinking about the less doom and gloom side of things, which is the way forward, or the ways forward from our current situation. And so for the second part of this talk today, I'm going to consider the role of culture and the arts in politics, and think about how maybe a critical intersection or dialogue between the culture and the arts and politics can help us to reconsider, reframe, and ultimately retake the commons. Now, the commons. What are the commons? We alluded to it briefly at the beginning of this talk. From the earliest laws of the land, the commons were understood as a set of natural resources, resources that should be accessible to all members of a society. A sense of stewardship and of responsibility was key to this definition. We would pass on the commons to a future generation. And as time went on, understandings of the commons have evolved. And now they have an environmental scope, but also they've become a contemporary buzzword, a way to describe new models of doing society, giving the commons a capacity that's both digital and environmental, political and social, cultural and economic. It's the economic commons I want to focus on today, because finance is central to the operation of contemporary society. And in 21st century economies, the money markets matter more than ever. Operating with the apparent aims of efficiency and cohesion, the financial sector has long been an extended benefactor of our public trust. Since the 1970s, the size and the importance of the financial sector relative to the overall economy has grown exponentially. This process, often referred to as financialization, has been subject to renewed interest in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Fueled by the growth of the so-called FIRE, finance, insurance and real estate industries, financialization occurred as a result of a shift away from industrial capitalism across the 20th century, and a shift towards both macro and microeconomics being impacted on changes in how the financial markets are structured, and by enabling the rapid growth of the financial sector. In the United States, for example, the financial sector comprised only 2.8% of GDP in 1950, but by 2012, that figure had risen to 7.8%. So this process of financialization then not only created a dependency on the financial industries, but also changed the ethics, the values, and the outlook of our wider society. Transforming everything into an asset and all exchanges into competitive encounters, alongside globalization and neoliberalism, financialization marked a new stage for capitalism in the 21st century, and I would argue has actually come to define the first decade of the new millennium. Elevating the significance of the financial sector, financialisation created increasing inequality among classes, races and genders, as well as profoundly altering the relationship between individuals and financial institutions. Now, prior to the credit crunch, the financial sector had led us, the public, to believe that individuals had more control over and understanding of their money than ever before. From internet and telephone banking to mobile phone payments and the rise of the credit card, money appeared hyper-visible. By 2008, everyday finance, such as mortgages and consumer debt, had become deeply embedded in our everyday lives. Consumers readily spent money that they did not physically own in the form of credit. This fiction masked the truth that money was neither tangible nor safe. Dubbed a money-geddon, most famously by The Guardian, the financial apocalypse, this kind of metaphor of the end of the world, became a common way to describe the financial crash of 2007 to 8. This crash shattered a popular belief in money, creating doubt about its representational value and security. It made money, the very thing that we think we know most intimately, deeply uncanny. Fragmenting the symbolic illusion that money stood for something safe and valuable, the credit crunch exposed the fiction of money, causing our narrative of the financial system to fall apart. When paper money became aligned with virtual forms of currency whose worth was not materially anchored, the true instability of money and the systems through which it operated were exposed, and our popular narratives about finance failed as fictions. Before 2008, the banking system itself was a form of fiction, a myth which was widely believed. The story generally went like this. The bank, a physical place that was known and trusted by all of us, took customers' money, kept it safe, lent it to equally other safe lenders, who then paid it back with interest, enabling customers to gain reward for their savings and to banks to lend to more customers over time. But this fictional system was based on a long-gone relationship, but one that the public was happy to believe and alongside the banks were guilty of perpetuating. In reality, financial systems were a world away from this fairy tale narrative of responsibility, ethical mutuality and safety. When a large number of customers chose to withdraw their money at the same time, as very famously in the case of Northern Rock, the bank collapsed, unable to honour either the funds entrusted to it by its customers or sustain common beliefs about how banking systems work. The credit crunch then blew popular narratives about banking apart, proving them to be literally incredible. It showed the general public that the stories about finance in which we'd all placed our trust were false. And in response to the need for new understandings of banking, the economic crisis and its aftermath, in the months and years that have followed, culture and the arts have set about establishing new alternative narratives and representations of these era-defining events. But what of the ways forward? Well, the ways forward from the credit crunch raise really important economic, social, political, and, I would argue, moral questions. The consequences of the credit crunch are going to affect our society for years, if not decades to come. The governments of the UK and the US responded to the financial crash by transferring the debt bubble from a private sector problem to a public sector burden. While banks were given huge sums of money to bail themselves out, public spending was cut in a desperate attempt to balance the books. Capitalism then effectively became monopolistic. We were asked to accept lower wages as a result of the fact that we've got austerity and actually we're lucky to have jobs in the first place, but also to accept that corporations should maybe pay a little bit less tax because we're lucky that they're in our country in the first place. Austerity has then enabled private companies to move into the very sectors that were abandoned by the state as a result of austerity, while neoliberalism, this ideology Andrew referred to, that was actually supposed to prevent state spending in the long run, has instead put the state in debt to the tune of millions of pounds. Neoliberal approaches to the post-crash context have become characterised by this acronym, TINA, there is no alternative. The acronym draws on Margaret Thatcher's use of the phrase in the 1980s, and it aligns austerity with what Professor Mary Mellor calls handbag economics, this idea that the economy should be run like a household budget and you simply shouldn't spend more than you take home at the end of the month.
But the crash then exposed deep deficits with neoliberalism and with financialisation, deep problems. And it produced a coalition government whose response was to take a debt created by the private sector and transform it into a debt to society as a whole. Unlike the quantitative easing offered by the banks post-2008, the state, it was argued post the crash, could not simply self-fund by printing money. So the relationship between the financial sector and the public sector post-crash has become one that is not beneficial or mutual, but is actually profoundly abusive. Forced to justify its very existence in the wake of the credit crunch, the state has been subject to bullying, a constant defence of its models and function and its future viability. A foundation of this relationship was the neoliberal assumption, one that we keep hammering home even now after the credit crunch, that the private model is correct and the state model is unsustainable. And out of this new austerity came a growing structure of feeling in contemporary society, a palpable need for an alternative that emerged in the months leading up to the general election of 2015. It's perhaps not surprising then that in 2015 we had the emergence of issue-based parties that fragmented the general mass vote, the SNP, the Greens, the BNP, small issues and movements that were beginning to gain momentum. Whether aligned to one of these groupings or disengaged from politics altogether, the turnout in the 2015 general election suggested a significant shift away in the long term from the three former big boys of British politics. In terms of the UK situation, the Corbin Campaign was created post-general election pretty much in a heartbeat overnight, but it actually functioned to unite a team of lobbyists, union leaders and local MPs and this wider grassroots momentum that had been building up before May. It united them and redirected seemingly disparate smaller groups into one united cause, and that cause was a search for an alternative. Now, the people versus the 1% had been an emergent theme in terms of anti-capitalist protest for a very long time, but it became crystallised following the financial crash of 2008. That's because it tapped into this wider discontent that government was concerned with representing the elite, the 1%, rather than the very electorate that voted them into that position in the first place. In summer 2015, this network of grassroots movements of doers, people who were actively getting involved in the process, propelled the Corbin campaign into a national network of quite powerful proportions. Now, these groups proposed an alternative to the received logic and passive acceptance of austerity and of neoliberal capitalism, and they drew upon notions of the contemporary commons to offer these alternative models of change. Some centred on new models of the environmental commons we were talking about earlier, like the Green Party, focusing on the ecological economics of the commons, the idea that sustainability is both environmental and financial, and should be based on this understanding of a shared earth and shared natural resources. George Monbiot calls this the natural capital agenda, arguing that we shouldn't just sweep aside attempts to make the natural world economic and to quantify it. We should actually embrace it, take it seriously, and almost price up the natural world in order for people to think about how we use resources and the amount in which we are using. And this has recently fed into new policy proposals like the Green Investment Bank. Other groups chose to focus on the social commons, arguing for increased social mobility, renationalisation, social sharing to reduce waste and improve efficiency, and think about more community-centred models of business. And this then feeds into the creative commons and the digital commons, exemplified by organisations such as the copyleft movement that is against copyright, and thinking about permission culture and marketisation in the arts. Significantly, what unites these commons-based alternatives in politics is not only that they are post-neoliberal, but also post-socialist, and in the words of Paul Mason's new book, post-capitalist. So these are alternative groups, but how can they retake the commons in a post-crash world? Economics is not a choice between the markets or the state. At a macro-social level, neoliberal capitalism has affected our values and our personalities as citizens of the 21st century world. Sociologist Bauman neatly summarises the paradox of our era here, saying, "Never have we been so free, never have we felt so powerless." This is because neoliberal capitalism produces alienated consumers instead of engaged citizens. The way forward, then, involves moving beyond both the market and the state. In rejecting neoliberalism, we reject its social values and instead align our society with engaging and mobilising. We reject the monetarisation of nature, of human relationships, of ethics, of health, of education, and of the moral core of society. The end has to define the strategy. That is basic management 101. And what each of those commons-based alternatives offers is the idea that fiscal policy cannot be the tail that wags the dog. We need a monetary policy based on social justice, a back-to-basics approach, one reminiscent of another post-trauma period, 1945, that focuses on remodelling education, healthcare, and employment. Business and finance will always form a very important part of these discussions, but culture can also illuminate the need to challenge the reign of neoliberalism and offer alternatives for managing the commons to create a different 21st century society. Admitting that something is not working is a very vital step towards a recognition and an impetus to change. In 2010, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, used an open lecture to tell the public that the credit crunch had taught us, quote, that economics is too important to be left to economists. Encouraging us to stop dreaming, these debates for alternatives focus the credit crunch on part of a wider dialogue about the need to move forward towards a new system, one governed by tighter regulation, intelligent finance, and an end to these mystifications that have masked the operation of financial systems to date. Any movement to retake the commons foregrounds the need to think carefully about contemporary uses of capital and the possibility, ultimately, of making capital our servant rather than our master. Thank you.
Okay, has anybody got any questions for either speaker? Yes?
Yeah, I guess it's aimed at Katy, but you both might want to sort of address this. And I'm just thinking of, obviously, the sort of, I was going to say the pig in the room then, but I think I meant elephant, which is obviously the Tory government. So, and that's just thinking about the extent to which if you think of this through the lens of the arts and culture, the extent to which they're ideologically driven in terms of the appointment of Whittingdale and what's been happening recently to make the arts and culture increasingly narrow in terms of access, precisely because perhaps they're picking up on the sorts of changes and shifts that you're talking about. So is that something they're fighting to sort of restrict mobility and access around culture and the arts and to privilege, the elite arts? And then I guess the second thing is, just thinking in relation to that, particularly in relation to the creative and digital commons, is much of that, there's an argument that much of that is being done through something like social media. So then is there a danger that this argument that we're in a little bit of a vacuum in social media, and it's sort of almost the danger is you end up preaching to the converted rather than actually going beyond that to this great mass of the electorate who we really need to sort of get to.
Okay, so 2 parts. The first part, I think, thinking about access. Access to the arts has always been historically a very, very contentious issue. I think it was interesting for me when I wrote Crunchlet, which just came out a few weeks ago, to think about the way in which and why the arts and culture were the first victims of the credit crunch. If you are doing handbag economics and you have got to cut back on your household budget, what goes first out of your shopping basket? And why is it the arts and culture that get the chop at the checkout? That was a huge concern to me because it has always been the case historically. Post-2008, there was a lot of criticism of government, not just within the UK, but globally, across the world, governments decided to slash. And obviously there's a critical capacity to the arts and culture, which may not always be welcome in a post-traumatic period. Equally, I think the arts offer quite a vital critical role in society, and access to them is always limited. But again, if we're thinking about access to education, access to state welfare, these things were also restricted post-credit crunch. And this is where this idea of the fact that there is no alternative comes from. That, if you want to balance the books, something has to go and this is the something. I think the idea to counter handbag economics is to think about the way in which maybe if you didn't do PPE at Oxford, there are other narratives and there are other ideologies that suggest ways out of a deficit. And obviously, you know, historically we see alternative models in America and the UK having functioned quite effectively. I think in terms of social media, there is always the danger of having your own little dialogue. And as long as you're talking to the same people, you do run the risk of preaching to the converted. There are also obviously implications in terms of social media about who owns those social media platforms and the data with which, you know, is being harvested and marketed, etc. I do think they're very useful platforms for organising and for gathering groups. They're very good in terms of communication, less so perhaps for the younger generation than we might have thought previously. But I do think they offer really important roles, and I think Twitter, seeing the role of Twitter being involved in GE 2015, we found it very, very useful in terms of campaigning and canvassing, certainly. Yeah.
Power never volunteers to give up its power. So how do you envisage that things will change? It seems to me the system is simply hardening rather than softening, and the only way that any radical change will occur is through revolution or some kind of catastrophe that allows for change.
Andrew, do you want to
Yeah,
start this?
power it's trying to harden, and you know, we've got George Osborne sort of painting himself as the Iron Chancellor who's wielding the axe over, you know, all of government spending. But there was an interesting story today about David Cameron writing a letter to his own constituency chairman in Oxford, who was saying, look, the cuts are just hurting people. This is a Tory constituency. There's just too many libraries closing, you know, too many people being affected by the cuts. And Cameron sort of showed a complete ignorance of what was happening. And of course, Osborne's also been tripped up on tax credits for low-income working families. So I think they're having a hard time hanging on to their own agenda. I don't think it's quite as bleak as that. I don't think it's going to need a revolution to get rid of the Tories. I can remember when they were in power for a very, very long time, but they didn't stay there. So I think there are still prospects for democratic change and for the austerity agenda to collapse and to simply fail under the weight of its own contradictions.
I think to achieve that, though, we do need alternatives, and we need viable alternatives, and it is not enough just to suggest that alternatives exist. In the same way as we, you know, bought into a very fictional narrative about banking in the financial sector, it's very easy to all unite and go, yeah, we don't want this, we want something different. Okay, well, what is it? You know, the Russell Brand effect. If you're going to preach an alternative, you better be damn sure you know what that alternative is. And you better have tangible policy alternatives and tangible interventions that have been fully costed and thought through. And I think certainly now what we do need to see in politics are those alternatives coming forward so people can make informed choices and can actually consider ways in which as a society we can approach alternative models. Because at the moment citing an alternative is great and the need for one, but actually as a public we all need to be fully engaged in thinking about creatively about what those alternatives would be.
Yes.
Sorry, I think I'm just picking on the word social justice and looking at marginalised communities and them having access to using culture and art as a tool to be political. From your point of view, and looking at the younger generation, how do we empower them to look at that social justice movement and look at the importance of identifying the key issues that are oppressing them to access the arts and finding creative tools on raising awareness? We've got the culture of it, Beckett in Leeds. How do we tap in together and start creating a momentum that helps us save the arts and culture and inspire the next generation to see this as a way forward, specifically the marginalised communities, communities that don't actually see arts and culture as a tool to actually make a difference. So that's my question to the two.
I think the key thing for me is dialogue. And dialogue is key in all of these things, whether it's across social media, whether it's at events, it's about organising and talking to each other. Because if we are currently in a situation, I think we're a little bit further along than we were perhaps in May, that we had alienated people and people who weren't talking to each other. In the same way as if you stopped somebody in the street and asked them about something, you may get several people coming up with the same answers. Ultimately, they weren't engaging with each other, and there wasn't this sense of a community of feeling or a solidarity forming. Certainly in terms of marginalised communities or communities that traditionally haven't been as engaged with the arts and culture, we need that dialogue, we need participation. And politics should be founded on participation and dialogue. I think we tend to invert our current political system to constantly look at politicians and Parliament, you know, the House of Commons, as almost a soap opera that we passively glimpse into, like we would neighbours or EastEnders at the end of the day, and we actually forget that they are our employees, they're our representatives, that we can hire and fire them, and that we need to think more critically about our own agency as individuals and also as communities, and perhaps increasingly rethink what the concept of the community stands for in the 21st century, whether that's physical, whether that's online, whether it's a regional community or a national community politically.
Can I just ask you to say something about the project you're working on in Wortley? Because
Yes.
that's an example of something concrete. And my question was going to be, can you both give maybe just one example of an actual cultural intervention, either that you're involved in or that you know of, that you think is actually making a difference? I know what you're going to say, because I know about it.
Yeah, so we've been very lucky to have been awarded some money by the university to do a project which is looking at socio-cultural regeneration in Leeds City regions. So we're working with 5 marginalised communities across the Leeds City regions to think about the ways in which culture and the arts can help regenerate and draw in marginalised groups. So I'm working with New Wortley Community Centre. We're looking at a creative writing project, a community history project. They've got a brand new community centre that's being built by Leeds Beckett University architects and their project office. We're working with them to retell the history of their community visually through graphic narrative on the top floor of the youth centre. So we've got people from, I think it's 8 to 80 roughly, involved in that project. And that's going to hopefully evolve into a creative writing class and group going forward. But certainly as a university, we're incredibly committed to bringing the culture and the arts to our local communities, but also thinking about our national role. So with Palgrave in the centre, we're involved in the campaign for the humanities, as Susan said at the top.
I'm a very poor community activist, I must admit. I guess the people I engage with, though, most often, I guess, are students. And basically what I do is theory, it's critique, it's not public engagement, it's not community activism.
Apart from today.
Apart from today. It's a rare foray into that field. But what I do is I teach a lot of undergraduate students, and I try to tell them about the history of capitalism, and I try to explain how capitalism works, that it's not a natural or eternal system. You know, it's not necessarily what we should all be doing for all time, that it evolved historically and can therefore be changed and superseded. But I guess alongside that, the thing that's on my mind at the moment, having read Paul Mason's book, Post-Capitalism, and talked about it recently, is this idea of scarcity that people want to frighten us with when they close down our public services and make us pay not just high tuition fees, but interest on living costs for students, which just appalls me. It's that we live in a wealthy economy. We live in, by some measures, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. It produces over $1 trillion annually. We live in an economy that should be about abundance rather than scarcity, and we ought to be debating and talking about how we share the abundance, not how we try and make people accept the fact that there just isn't very much wealth, because there is lots of wealth. We just have to understand how it's created and democratically deliberate on how we share it.
I think understanding is key there, because a huge issue and a challenge for both finance and culture and the arts is understanding and participation, because certainly when I started writing my book, I couldn't have told you the difference between a CDO and an SIV. Key terms in economics, key terms to understand the credit crunch. But when you read some of these financial reports, if you don't understand the language, if you haven't got the lingo, you can't penetrate it. It's quite complicated stuff. And it's almost about kind of improving our financial education and our financial literacy in the same way as if you perhaps haven't been to the theatre before, you may not be au fait with theatre etiquette, with the concept of an interval, or if you've not read a long poem before. And it's about feeling comfortable within those contexts. And I think increasingly both finance and culture and the arts run the risk of alienating people through a lack of familiarity and a lack of accessibility as well to both of them.
So do you think that some of it is about improving, for example, students and other people's cultural capital?
I think it's about improving financial literacy,
Yes.
certainly. I think it's appalling that you can get through primary school without actually knowing how a bank account works. And I think it's ridiculous that most people on the street couldn't tell you who their credit card debt was owed to or the APR on their credit card. And actually, if you say what happened to the credit crunch, I didn't fully understand when I started writing the book. It's incredibly complicated. And today, if I asked anybody who you owe your mortgage to, you might be able to tell me, Newcastle Building Society, HSBC, but it's not. It's chopped up and partitioned across a huge range of investors across the world. So it's this transparency of finance as well in education that we need to work on.
Yeah, I guess for me it's financial literacy combined with anti-capitalist critique.
Yeah, I think we've just got time for maybe two more, so maybe you and over here as well.
Okay, just a very quick one about geography and the scale. I mean, you talked about a global picture and a global gap between labour and capital, and we looked at it nationally. But if we were to have that conversation about abundance and sharing and abundance, could we realistically have it here in Leeds? Does it have to be global change? Could we do something within the city here, regardless of how fast that change is happening outside? What chance do we stand of success if we just try and tackle it, perhaps within the city or the city region?
If you believe the Northern Powerhouse agenda, then we have an awful lot of potential to do that. I'm sure I have very well known problems with the Northern Powerhouse concept, and I'm not particularly happy squatting within a conservative concept that I think is ultimately flawed. I do think that the North as a region, and Leeds, the city region, has an awful amount of power and agency to do something different, if it does believe that it wants to do something different and to strike out and offer a new model of how we should do things. I think Leeds, as somebody who's still relatively a newcomer to Leeds, as a national player, Leeds does tend to sit quite kind of below the surface. It has a huge amount of potential economically, but also culturally. And certainly for those of us who are involved in the 2023 Capital of Culture bid, that's something we're definitely trying to reframe and show how Leeds can do something different, moving out of the teenage years of the 21st century into a further period.
I must admit, my knowledge of local politics is not perfect by any means, but I mean there might be scope here for changing the government's devolution agenda. I'm not sure entirely how far that could be owned and taken hold of by local communities. But if they mean what they say and that ends up happening, that local governments end up having more power and autonomy over their fiscal affairs, over their local taxes and so on, then surely a city could do something like raise the living wage, have a proper living wage rather than a token one, and increase local business rates and taxes and redistribute that way. So devolution maybe has some potential.
And I think there was one more that I said coming over here somewhere. No?
Was that NASA?
Yeah, it was NASA.
Sorry. I was looking for some clarity about underconsumption. And I was reading it maybe one of two ways. I think what you meant was to say that it's underconsumption is the kind of logical end of the narrative of profit that capitalism requires, that we will always make more, and that there's a point at which nobody has the money to spend. Is that underconsumption?
Yeah, they don't have enough to buy back everything that capitalists want to sell.
Yeah, okay. Because I was thinking the other way of putting it was, or is it possible to think of underconsumption as a strategy?
Yeah.
It
is.
Okay. Maybe that's a longer conversation.
Yeah. I mean, there's a very interesting Japanese Marxist called Karatani who has this notion of consumer boycotts.
Yeah.
So Karatani basically says, well, workers don't have any agency anymore at the point of production because the trade unions have been squashed everywhere. But what we do have is power in our pockets in terms of our spending power, because if we don't keep showing up at the stores to buy all the consumer goods, the capitalists won't make a profit, and they can't continue. And the system would soon collapse, because so much of advanced economies depends on consumer demand. You know? A huge chunk of the economy is basically shoppers. I think that's very interesting. But alongside that, Karatani wants to develop this new local-based trading communities that don't use money, that use a kind of form of electronic trading that's non-profit based, and they just swap goods and services locally amongst themselves.
Yeah.
And then you have a lot more democratic and democratic economies based on people's needs rather than just their temporary wants.
But there is also a counter-narrative to that idea, because there's also the evidence that in terms of worker agency, it may just be taking different forms in the 21st century. So somebody did a study of Chinese workers who made iPhones in factories, and although they were notorious for having appalling working conditions, next to no breaks, one thing that they did do in their breaks was talk to the iPhone workers in the next factory, find out how much they were working, then go back and demand more money to match the wage in the next factory and the next factory and the next factory. So they had their own little microeconomy going on in terms of competition. So worker agency may just be working at slightly less tangible and more complicated ways.
Okay.
I suppose it's worth remembering that it was announced yesterday that Asda will not be doing Black Monday, is it? You know, where
Black
they have
Friday.
Black Friday, where they have all the Christmas sales, because apparently consumers don't want that anymore. So I'll leave you with that thought. And thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you at the next talk in December. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.